Test. Test, 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 test. Spaceships are lifting off of a dying world, yeah. Millions are left behind as the sky burns, yeah. Wasn't room for you and I, yeah, yeah. Only you, yeah. So baby, there's no need to cry, yeah, yeah. I love you, bye. Good evening, everyone. We'll get started soon, just getting everything set up. All right, we are now live on Instagram as well. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jhani Travette. I'm also known as the Young Seer and your host for the Young Seers podcast, your source for rich intellectual and spiritual content, where we discuss the questions of the time, of the day, and the popular movements of our time as well. A seer is someone with a level of insight so penetrating that it seems magical or supernatural. These are people whose brains are wired in a way that makes them highly perceptive to the degree that they are viewed as having some degree of psychic or prophetic abilities. That's the simplest definition I can offer you. But I discuss this at length in my new book, Too Wise, Too Young, the first testimony of the young seer, in which I lay out all the technicalities and the underlying mechanics that make someone a seer. I highly recommend it. It's a fairly easy read, despite addressing some very deep topics. For anyone who would like to know any more about the book, a free sample is now available at my website, toowisetooyoung.com. You can see the link in the anywhere on my social media, but toowisetooyoung.com. By the way, I may mention my book a few times tonight, not merely to promote it, but because the content of the book is relevant to the times, which of course is why I wrote it. That said, my purpose tonight is to discuss what I see coming for the year 22. But this is in the context of a larger assignment that I am complete in the first episode, which will be uploaded after tonight. And it'll be you'll be able to find the podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, and it'll be edited um, accordingly for the format. But ultimately, I want to arm my viewers or listeners tonight this evening, I should say, with the message, with this message, those who are listening to this message with the information necessary to push back against some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight. So, a lot of what I'm going to say tonight, in my mind, hopefully, is more preventative than predictive. And so, what I'm doing tonight is preemptively pushing back against some of the dark forces of anti intellectualism and authoritarianism that are and will continue to be at play in our politics, um, if we are unclear about what's going on. Of course, if everybody's informed, then it's harder to for those forces to take root. Finally, tonight, I want to speak to everyone who considers themselves American citizens of the United States, especially millennials. There's just some things that need to be said. And I think we'll all agree. And I got the time tonight. So thank you for tuning in. Please share, like this video so that others can view as well. So the big question is, what is coming in the year 2022? And my best answer to that, how I would prefer to frame it, is American revival is coming starting in 2022. In fact, we are already in the midst of it. It may not seem like it or look like it, but anybody who's ever been through an identity crisis, which at some point, at some level, everybody will go through an identity crisis, which is actually the major theme of my book. Um, and also, I believe it is the main reason some religions, and I'll go into this later, but even Christianity, the main reason Christianity was even formed or created was to deal with the identity crisis that came with the falling of the temple, um, and temple culture in Jerusalem in first century Middle East. So yeah, uh, America is going through, especially those on the political right or those many in the Republican Party. America is going through a bit of an identity crisis, largely because there is a blind spot in our psyche, in the collective psyche of America, largely that has to do with how the country was formed. So when I say American revival, I don't mean merely an economic recovery. I mean a powerful intellectual awakening similar to the one that led to the American Revolution or the forming of the United States as a self-governing nation. If you want to gain insight into the mindset of the people living in the American colonies before 1776 and during 1776, when America was formed, in the time leading up to the American Revolution, you have to understand two things. Number one, you have to understand what was happening in Europe, the cultural and intellectual headquarters, so to speak, for European colonists. And number two, you have to understand social movements in the American colonies, such as Bacon's Rebellion, and the racial hierarchy established to counter such rebellions, where you had, excuse me, indentured Europeans forming alliances with Africans, free Africans, indentured, and Africans who were brought over as slaves. And yes, there were free Africans in America at the forming of the United States. So let's actually get into let's actually get into that for a second, and then I'm going to actually name the thing that I'm really want you guys to be focused on and be watchful for this year. Many people don't realize, others sometimes forget, that the United States was founded as a result of a very powerful spiritual or intellectual movement that broke out across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, which was a byproduct of the scientific revolution that started in the 16th century. This movement is known as the Enlightenment, and it effectively ended the middle age of superstition and religious dogma that preceded it, where you could be imprisoned or killed for for teaching anything contrary to church dogma or state religion. There was this huge uh, burst of energy rebelling against religious authority. That is what was the most important factor during the time in which the United States was actually formed as an independent nation. And so being able to push back against religious authority was completely opposed to the medieval worldview that defined the previous 1,000 years. Religious institutions had lost their moral authority, and people were desperate for a new political order. The Enlightenment also contradicted the racial caste system that had been institutionalized in the American colonies. The invention, which the invention of the racial caste system, or anti the sentiment in the American colonies against African heritage, was invented by the ruling class seeking to prevent alliances between the European indentured servants and Africans. Um, yes, so racism and race did not always exist. People did not always look at each other as um, black or white or somewhere along the spectrum. You were like European, African, or wherever you were from. Um, and so, yes, even before the United States were formed, there was alliances being formed between quote unquote white people and quote unquote black people, and then which spooked those wealthy, rich, higher classmen, because they feared the unity of common folk. They saw it as a threat to their wealth. In my book, I make a quote. I said, "With the rise of liberalism, this is as opposed to authoritarianism in the previous age. With the rise of liberalism, slavery now constituted an evil. Abolitionist laws were passed in most northern states immediately following the American Revolution, and slavery became the most contentious issue in the drafting of the United States Constitution. As a result of the American Revolution, the United States became the firstborn nation of the Age of Reason. Yet by this time, sentiment against African heredity had hardened, being deeply set into the culture." Another quote from my book is, "The perceived racial supremacy of people with European heredity would serve as a formidable force to liberalism. Dehumanizing people of African descent constituted a moral contradiction to the principles of Enlightenment." So by the time the American country was formed, there was already some deep cultural like hate against African heritage. But at the same time, people were going through this intellectual change that switched them over from the thinking of authoritarian and religious authority. And so now at this point, there is this contradiction living in many people who lived in America. I go on to say racial contempt turned supremacists into savages, and they were too consumed with fear and greed to see the irony. Even after the American Civil War, white nationalists continued to disenfranchise and terrorize Americans of African descent with religious and political fervor. They invented a social version of Darwinism's survival of the fittest, presenting spurious ideas as facts established by science to influence public policy, and they were quite successful. That's in chapter 6. And what you'll notice in chapter 6 of my book is I give an entire intellectual heritage of our nation, which I believe in present times goes largely overlooked. and that is causing problems everywhere politically. Um, and I want to point out that is what is actually I'll get to this later, but it's also going to be, I foresee it causing issues in schools, and definitely in this election year. There's coming an attack on teachers and attack on schools, and I want to preemptively prepare you for that. But what I just referred to as the Enlightenment, this great awakening that happened, that caused the American colonies to become independent from Europe, or England to be precise. That movement was very, very powerful. Um, but that it goes overlooked in present times, largely because slavery makes our founders look hypocritical. That the Enlightenment didn't immediately cure racism makes the movement seem weak, impotent, or unsuccessful to some. As a result, a huge blind spot has developed in the ethos, or the consciousness of our country relating to our founding values, which has given opportunity for cynicism to flourish. And I want you to really get that word in your mind, because that's really what I'm going after tonight, is the spirit of cynicism. Cynics would have Americans of African descent to believe that the American Revolution occurred in order to preserve racial slavery and the anti-Black racial hierarchy of the colonial era. Cynics would have Americans of European descent to believe that liberal democracy won't work for them in a non-white majority. You see where I'm going here? That they may suffer vengeance for the nation's past transgression. So it's causing like a huge like struggle between cynics on the left and cynics on the right. And I want to be clear that this is what you're seeing now, like in the news with the Republicans. It's not just happening on the Republican side. Yeah, there's a lot of cynicism happening on the left as well, which is actually triggering them. So, and I'll go into details of exactly what I'm talking about soon. But again, cynics would have Americans of African descent believe that the American Revolution occurred in order to preserve racial slavery and the anti-Black racial hierarchy of the colonial era. Cynics would have Americans of European descent to believe that liberal democracy can't work for them. And so that's when stuff like January the 6th come into play, where they don't care about who was elected president. They want to throw it all away, burn it all down, and establish something new, something illiberal. Cynics on both sides would have us forget the Reconstruction. They would have us forget the Civil Rights Movement, the cross-racial alliances that drove these movements, the advancement of reason, science, and technology that fueled invention, provided employment, debunked racism, and brought us together. Uh, Term limits and perpetual regime change gives the United States, or the American nation, the ability to be reborn and evolve again and again. It keeps us young. Yet, relative to other nations, we remain a young nation uh, overall, who still has some growing to do. And when I say that we are on the verge of a major revival, I mean we are on like the verge of the same uh, revival that actually gave birth to our nation. And I'll go into this over time in multiple episodes, but I want you to be mindful of this. Of we're going through the early, very, very early stages of a revival, and number two, the spirit of cynicism is actually indicative of that. And I'm purposely framing it in that way. This brings me, of course, to the political turmoil currently at play in today's politics. As you know, 2022 is an election year. What I say next, as I said before, is hopefully more preventative than it is predictive. I foresee an attack on teachers. This is important to me because I consider myself a lifelong educator. Not only have I traveled to speak in front of many audiences, but I have taught in public education um, for I have 7 years experience in public school education. Uh, and I see now why I was called to actually do that. So pray for teachers and school officials. Those of you, even if you're not particularly spiritual or religious, when I tell you to pray for something, it's meaningful because those of you who follow me on Facebook, I told you to pray for Georgia back during the last election year, and we see what happened there. So pray for teachers this year. Again, I hope what I'm saying is more preventative than it is predictive, because they will endure a great deal of antagonism this year. And it is not because cynics necessarily hate teachers. It's because they're going to employ certain arguments that's going to like force them to antagonize school officials, including teachers. Cynics seeking to gain political power will try to make the classroom the new battleground for their culture wars. You have probably noticed that cynics have hijacked what is called the critical race theory and somehow made it controversial. And this isn't just happening, and again, in Trump land, it's happening on the political left. So anybody who is invoking critical race theory in order to promote cynicism is causing harm. I'll say that one more time. Anybody who is invoking or hijacking critical race theory and trying to somehow make it controversial is causing harm. Critical race theory, if I were to break it down into a very simple definition, critical race theory is simply the idea right after the civil rights movement, the civil rights act passed. People still notice that there were some like discrepancies between the accomplishments of white Americans and black Americans, um, and scholars came together because they were questioning whether it had something to do with lingering laws that were on the books, for example, during Jim Crow and even before that. Um, I think people can get too obsessed with comparing white people and black people. Obviously, there's going to be some lingering effects from slavery, but we should not obsess over every distinction between what is happening in white America and compare it to what is happening in black America. That oversimplifies a lot of issues. It also unnecessarily, the word I want to use is I want to use envy, but I think the better word to use here is resentment, because a lot of us, and not just our ancestors, but a lot of us can trace a lot of the issues that are going on in our families back to slavery, whether it's illiteracy, um, lack of resources, lack of opportunity. So a lot of us can do that, and so there is much work to do to undo the effects of hundreds of years of anti-African sentiment and anti-African heritage sentiment in this country. Um, but again, every difference between a white person and a black person should not necessarily be attributed to race or racism. And it seems like over time that we've gotten obsessed with that. And we have to stop that. There has always been some overlap between Trump supporters and supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders. They both attract what I call cynical people. And in fact, if the number of people who voted for Sanders and later then voted for Trump had voted for Hillary Clinton, then Secretary Clinton at the time would have won the 2016 election. This type of person is like the type of person that's calling for like revolution, burn the whole thing down, rebuild it from scratch. But if history has taught us anything, for example, the French Revolution, is that political revolutions based on cynicism, mob justice, and an attempt to force outcomes don't turn out to be successful as well. In fact, you can have a revolution and it turns out that you get the opposite of what you want. So cynicism is not going to help any of the issues in our country, and it's certainly not going to give us anything necessarily that we want. Excuse me. The next thing I want to say is that educators in this country are overwhelmingly white. There's no huge critical race theory crisis going on in our schools. It does not make any sense. And this culture war that's being propagated by the right, the political right in this country, just does not make any sense. 8 out of 10 teachers in the United States are white. So the idea that schools are promoting racism against white students doesn't make much sense and should be examined on its merits. That said, I am aware of some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings that are some of it can be concerning, and if you look at some of the critics against quote unquote critical race theory, that's actually really what they're referring to. They're referring to some of these workshops that come from diversity, equity, and inclusion um, um, activities. But my message to them, those folk who are trying to like get critical race theory out of schools, is to let the teachers handle that. They're smart enough. Back up, back off. You can't do anything about it. That's the teacher's job. They are competent enough. They can do what they need to do for their kids. And one thing I like about public education is the classroom is an experiment. Like your students are your subjects, and you are really experimenting on the best way to educate them. Nobody tells students what to think. We try to teach them how to think critically. So there's a lot of nuance that is being overlooked because our media catches cynicism and sensationalism and gives voice to these people. Social media has given voice to these people. There used to be like this reasonable center, which I still believe the majority of Americans are, but Twitter and social media and regular media, TV, especially corporate news channels, they give too much voice to cynics and to sensationalism. So I want you to be mindful of that so that you can push back on it. What are some things that you can do actually to push back against cynicism? It's going to sound weird, but first, you have to show kindness. A cynic is not going to respond to meanness or to you have to be careful how you approach them, because a lot of cynics are very wrapped up into the identity that they have formed around whatever argument that they are offering. So show kindness as you are discussing these issues with them. Understand the CRT conversation is really about cynicism and not CRT. 2, active listening. If you've never heard of active listening, I encourage you to look it up. is actually, I dedicate a whole chapter to it in my book and give examples of the power of active listening, which is you hear what somebody has to say, you basically reflect or repeat what they said to you back to them, and you want to reframe it so that you say it better than how they said it initially. And then you say, so that they know you understand them. You want to like build that rapport first, and then you say, okay, well, this is why I disagree. That is a very, very powerful tool and changing minds, basically. Number three, know that cynics are a minority whom Twitter and social media has given a platform. Number four, so you don't have to act desperate in your arguments with them. You can be who you are. You can be chill and kind. That affects them too. If you maintain your composure, that's power, very powerful to them, or in those situations. Number four, don't let cynics dominate or hijack the national conversation, which is basically what has been happening since what, 2016? Don't let cynics dominate or hijack the national conversation. Number five, positive messaging. Uh, if I were a Democrat running in an election this year, I would focus on uh, I would really craft my message around an American revival, unity based on reason, rejecting cynicism on the political left and the political right, talking about forwardness and not backwardness. Um, Frame anti-CRT that you're hearing, which is really cynicism, as an attack on teachers. So that will be uh, very, very powerful in dealing with these arguments that you're going to be hearing in the next few months, actually. I had another one in my mind. I'm trying to remember. Oh, last one is the most important. And I haven't fully fleshed this thought out yet, but and a lot of people are going to be like, "Oh, what?" No, but I would encourage people this year to register as Republican, vote in the Republican primary for the most reasonable candidate, and then in the general election, vote Democratic. It's time to occupy the Republican Party, not abandon it. There's this thing, for example, like what is going on with Joe Rogan and Spotify, where we tend to abandon ship when something's going on the ship that we don't like, and that's not necessarily the most effective way to handle the situation. Uh, I understand the sentiment or the desire to be anti-Republican, but we can't just leave a major political party over, just get handed over to authoritarians and anti-intellectuals. We can't just let people like Trump have their own political party. We have to occupy the Republican Party, become Republicans in the name of Martin Luther King Jr., and vote for the most reasonable Republicans. Mark my words, I actually anticipate that what's his name? Andrew Yang, who ran for president in the last Democratic primary, whatever you call it. I predict in the future that it's very possible that he will run for president again as a Republican, or at the very least as an independent. And his mindset is to give people a positive framework um, to grasp onto or hold on to, as opposed to this anti-liberal, anti everything a Democrat says, because you notice that they're not actually for anything; they're against whatever the Democratic says. Which, in, to give Barack Obama credit, he saw this, and one of his strategies, I believe, in looking from a distance, was to become extremely reasonable. if you become reasonable and your opponent doesn't actually have a position to debate for, everything they're going to say is going to sound absurd. So what he wouldn't even advocate for anything that was like speculative or extremely liberal. He would just say commonsensical stuff, and causes that again that caused his critics when they responded to look unreasonable. So I think that is a good strategy going forward. I think people should really start thinking about that. You shouldn't just abandon the Republican Party. You should probably join the Republican Party, vote for the most reasonable candidate, or even run yourself if you can do that. But we should not just leave uh, the Republican Party over to really. There's no really other way to say it, to domestic enemies who are against everything that America was founded on, which is the freedom of speech. This is all liberalism that I was talking about earlier. The freedom of thought, the freedom to think what you want, to say what you want. Uh, yeah, that's really what we should be fighting for this year. And I know that in the off election year, when it's not a presidential election, people tend to sit out. If you and hopefully if you I'll go ahead and confess, if you're like me, because I was traveling and stuff, and you didn't get a chance to vote in 2016, and you take responsibility for Donald Trump, which you should, then we all have a responsibility um, we all have a responsibility this election cycle to vote for, um, I would say, mostly Democrats, but the most reasonable candidates um, that are running. All right, so I got a whole lot more to say, but I wanted to jump on real quick to officially launch the podcast when it actually is available on podcast platforms. The transcript will be available along with notes from what I've been saying tonight, that you can follow along. This is my first time going live, I think ever. I've never been live. So I'm gonna go over and see if I can find. Shout out to my viewers on Twitch. I'm new to Twitch, so shout out to you all. If you're viewing me on Instagram, shout out to you. I'm going to pause here for any questions. Of course, I have to check multiple streams to see if anybody has any questions. Miss Kimberly Taylor, I see your comments. I had to go over to Facebook to actually see your comments. Thank you so much. All right, looks like just comments. I don't see any questions. So, before I close off for tonight, and of course, this is my first live. I promise you, I'm going to get better. Let me tell you something. When you're planning a live, for example, the live started at 6 p.m. tonight. Time flies. I was like, 6 p.m. comes fast when you got a live. And because it is my first live, I had a million things to do to get prepared for it, which is okay because that means I'll be more prepared for the next live and live after that. Um, and I hope to bring on guests as well. So yeah, um, thank you for tuning in tonight. Please continue to tune in as I get better. And hopefully I even become innovative at this thing. But yeah, go read chapter 1 of my new book. I just leaked it yesterday. If you are a site member or if you subscribe to our mailing list, you have already seen the notifications. Go ahead and read chapter 1 because I'm eager to discuss it with you guys. I'm eager to discuss the whole book, but we can take one step at a time. Let's do chapter 1 next. But yeah, I'm going to respond to Miss Taylor's point on Facebook. She said, "That's a very good point. Cynicism, democracy without white majority." Woo. Yeah. But the thing is, and maybe in the next episode, actually, I do plan to discuss my transformation over the years, because people who have followed me on Facebook, especially since 2019, may have been surprised to see that quote unquote prophetic side of me, which I actually did my best to hide when I was in college. There would be people in my dorm room. I would be like cutting hair or something, and like subjects or something would come up, and I would like say something that required me to know information that they knew I didn't know, and I would try to like play it off. Um, so I tried to like diminish that part of me, but I had um this a similar awakening um that many of you will have this year. um so when I say American revival, a lot of people think, oh my, oh, so some good stuff is going to happen. For a lot of people, it's not going to feel good. Identity crisis is prerequisite to rebirth. And so for some people that can take years to actually like go through. There can be layers of layers of shedding, especially when where you're going is so much different than where you're coming from. For so many years, I felt disconnected from my childhood, which is just and felt just lost. Like all those years of your childhood is like completely disconnected. Now, for those of you who don't know, I was basically born and raised in the church. And I went viral after just about 6 months on MySpace, back in the MySpace days. Shout out to those of you who met me on MySpace. And which is why I'm moving so slow now. My goal is to keep going viral too soon. And I don't mean to sound arrogant when I say that, but I was only on MySpace for like 6 months before my schedule just blew up. And people were devastated when they discovered that I had given up on all of it. I was traveling around the country, meeting people, just really touching and affecting people, and building relationships. And a lot of those people were hugely disappointed when I deleted all uh my website, all my videos online, all my speeches, lectures. But I began at that time, right before going to college, I began to poke holes in my faith, the stuff that I had been taught coming up to believe. And I'm not the type of person to ever to this day, I have never been the type of person to live contrary to what I believe. Ever. I have never been the type of person to preach a message or to forward an idea or an argument that I did not fully subscribe to. Ever. And so when my beliefs started to shift, I had to shut it all down. And I'm glad I did, because no one should go through identity crisis in front of people, at least in front of on media. So for all of you, um, you young intellectuals, particularly my brothers and sisters of faith, I want to warn you that you're going to be challenged, and it's not going to be comfortable, but that's the revival. You're going to die before you're reborn. And by die, I mean spiritual death. And I say in my book in chapter, let me read you a comment. I think this was chapter 4, about why people shun truth that is contrary to their belief system. Let me see. All of the young seers' online conversations demonstrated that willful blindness and intellectual dishonesty can be overcome if certain principles of communication are maintained. Defeating wrong ideas means identifying the fundamental flaw to which the believer or the belief system cannot provide an answer and persisting until they do. Once they show that they cannot answer satisfactorily, presenting blatantly fallacious responses, they effectively resign from the conversation. At this point, they either go silent or become fools, knowingly spouting gibberish. Either way, they concede their qualifications on the topic, having shown an inability to be objective concerning it. Let me pause there, because that sparked another thought. Because I want to talk about a lot of the controversy around critical race theory started with, well, I won't say started, but was fueled by the 1619 Project, which uh, is described by the creator of the 1619 as an artistic project. But what it does is try to reframe history, but it does it in a way, it does more than what I'm talking about now. But I believe I'm sorry, when it attempts to reframe history, it does so in a cynical way. You can't tell just because the founders of America owned slaves doesn't mean necessarily that the Enlightenment wasn't powerful or wasn't genuine or wasn't real. Let me tell you how you shouldn't know, because a lot of black people think that because we are oppressed, that automatically makes us righteous. Let me tell you how we should give grace to that time period. Just look at how black people treat LGBT, or have history. I think we're getting better at it, but just look at how black people have historically treated, or our sentiments surrounding LGBT people, LGBTQ. I don't know all the letters. We are like the purveyors. We are like, if there were people who were fighting for freedom, it's black Americans or Americans of African heritage. But at the same time, we have ways that are not liberal at all, like accepting people for who they are, and uh, not treating people horribly, or hating people, or ignoring science. So we can be bigots too. I want to be clear about that, because and the reason that text sparked that idea is because one of the justifications for the 1619 Project was that history isn't objective; it's all subjective. There are some actual facts of history that you can appeal to, and whatever claim you're making, if you're not saying, if you're not backing it up with evidence, then there's you're not reframing history. You're trying to rewrite history, and so for that reason, and don't get me wrong, I have no issue no, I don't hate or dislike the founder of the 1619 Project. In fact, she herself acknowledged that some of the criticism against it is legitimate. Um, but she, of course, she doesn't do much responding to that. She responds to the cynics. So this is what I'm saying. There's this conversation between cynics on one side and cynics on the other side, and they're taking up too much space. They're taking up too much of the conversation. They're hijacking the conversation, in fact. I go on to say, when information comes to disprove a fundamental belief, sending an entire thought system into collapse, trauma ensues. The mind enters a transformation process that is arduous and agonizing as the bonds between the dead belief system and the believer are broken. The notion that someone would resist such personal upheaval to preserve the identity and the social life that they have known or established surrounding around that belief system is unsurprising. But to refuse the truth and turn a blind eye to the lessons life has chosen to present is to invite great calamity upon oneself or be doomed to irrelevance, as 2020 has taught us. But what I really want to share with you is this. One could demonize the truth and bury it in the deepest pit of hell. That still would not make it a falsity. And someone intellectually honest will inevitably find it again. In all fairness, the human brain uses blindness all the time to compartmentalize experiences. Humans are beings of finite ability, living finite lives who must prioritize some information over other information to live functional lives. For example, no one goes through their every waking moment of the day contemplating the end of their life. Doing so would be unhealthy and unproductive. Despite life's fragility and the certainty of our eventual demise, we engage our days as if we will live for a very long time. Although our life here is but a brief flash in time, hope makes life meaningful and worth living. Love also dictates what data our minds prioritize and is powerful enough to neutralize a multitude of faults and flaws, casting wrongdoing into a sea of forgetfulness. That love is blind is an old truism. But like with hope, blindness from love is a natural and unconscious mechanism, one that is intended, for better or for worse, to shield us from unhappy truths. It is when we permit fear, however, to become the source of blindness, willfully allowing our emotional attachments to the illusions we project onto the world and onto ourselves to hinder the pursuit of truth, and purposely closing ourselves off to the relevant information that contradicts our fantasies or hypotheses, that blindness becomes intellectual dishonesty or self-deception with destructive consequences. A person tolerant of an abusive partner may call it love, but fear of loss is the force keeping them in the relationship. A person stubbornly committed to demonstrably false religious teaching may call it faith, but what is really at play is the fear of spiritual death, of losing one's security to conflict and confusion, one's soul to emptiness and uncertainty. I wanted to stop there, but the next paragraph is good as well. The painful psychological conversion that is forced upon an individual at the coming of life altering truth can be described as a baptism of sorts, the calamitous death and burial of the ego, but its ultimate glorious rebirth when the psyche is separated from its old body of beliefs before obtaining a new, updated way of looking at the world and the self, a new body. All who engage in an undying search for truth or a commitment to learning and personal development must sooner or later traverse this wilderness of identity crisis. Still, others encounter forceful, catastrophic truth by accident, not even seeking it at all. They too are forced into a painful divorce with their old way of thinking and the identity that they have built around that way of thinking, often without any clue of what, if anything, could replace it. This experience is characterized by confusion, insecurity, and displacement, or just plain feeling lost. The length of this process depends on the individual and often involves multiple layers of shedding. It had been around, and after that I go back into the story. So yeah, when I say American revival, for many of us, something happens when there's like this awakening that happened for me in 2017. Um, I talk about that in the book as well. For others of us, it's not going to feel good at first because it means something needs to be killed in order for that part of us that's going to live and thrive in the future to be awakened and resurrected. So yeah, when I say American revival, um, because again, I was brought up in church. When you say revival, they people think a certain way, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But I'm talking about a deep intellectual awakening coming to the entire well, not just the United States, the entire world, but especially places like the United States. I believe that the United States is special to God, and pardon me for getting, for those of you who are not very spiritual, pardon me here for a second, bear with me. I believe America is special to God for a reason that I'm going to go into on my next episode. I don't want to say too much tonight. But if you followed me on Facebook, you've seen my posts, and you've seen that the spirit has a lot of things to say to America, and there's a reason for that. And I want to talk about that next episode. So join me again. I will definitely tell you when we're going to be back. I'm going to clean up tonight's episode and then upload it to Spotify, Apple, all those places. And then we're going to be back for episode 2. The official release of my book, including the audio book, the digital book. Of course, I already have the paperbacks, the hard copies as well. Those will be on the way. Official release is February February the 25th. February the 25th, which is also my grandmother's birthday. If you went and read chapter number 1, you'll know why that's significant. So that's it for now, I think. But yeah, America's going through an identity crisis, but we're at that point where we're coming out of cynicism into faith again, into just remembering who we are and what we were founded on, which is the principles of enlightenment: freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. You worship how you want to, tolerance for other people's religions. Because if you got a religion, I got a religion. If we come together, we need to be able to reason with each other. Um, if we want to, if we want to live together, basically. Um, I don't want to say too much. I want to keep going because I feel like I'm getting heated up. I was a little nervous at first, but I'm finding my mojo. I feel my help is coming. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Um, let's do this again. Thank you so much, Miss Taylor, for commenting. I haven't gone on to any other platform, so I don't know if anybody else has commented. I haven't seen your comments, but I will definitely check them out after tonight. See you soon.